I'm going to print it out, the Mir session. All right, we'll say good morning, good yard. A privilege to be able to begin our new Tukuf, our winter's Zman Mir Hashem together. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Share to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Habalim, Melatova Yol, and Sarah Kelman in celebration of the completion of Seder Nezikin, and for Besaros Tovos for Am Yisrael, as well as Nathan Perry Smith for dedicating all the Shumer and Drushos this month in the schus of the entire Kehila. Our Day of Learning sponsor, Sarah Rubenstein, in memory of her husband, Hai Rubenstein, Chaim Ben Shmuel Moshe, Zichron Livracha, whose yard site is on the 24th of Tishrei, as well as by our Mishpacha, Le'ilui Nishmas, the yard site of my grandfather, Zichron Livracha, Menachem Mendel Ben Levi David, Zichron Livracha. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Stephen Jordani Galaskov, in honor of Yoni Frager's 42nd birthday. Okay, the Yoni Frager birthday season has begun. Baruch Hashem. Yoni Frager and Queen Elizabeth are the two people I know who celebrate their birthdays for an entire year. And Baruch Hashem, we wish Yoni a very happy birthday, Mirz Hashem. I will say, I just want to take just the first moment of this morning's share. I think that all of us are in a profound state of shock and overwhelming sadness and grief over the loss of Rabbi Howard Zichron Livracha. I'll just mention, and because Baltimore is a community that, people, Baruch Hashem, are interconnected in multiple sub-communities, and people daven at multiple shuls. Rabbi Howard has been a fixture of this community. I don't even know how many years. Certainly when I came to town 23 years ago, he was someone who was a tremendous chaver and a tremendous source of just inspiration and help. And I think it was amazing. I remember that after my first few interactions with Rabbi Howard, I always thought that I was losing my hearing. Because Rabbi Howard always spoke so softly. And it always struck me that a man who could speak in such a soft tone could be such a force. First a force within Baltimore, and then quite literally a force within Klal Yisrael. What Rabbi Howard, Zecher Tzadik V'Kadosh Livracha, accomplished at the helm of the OU, and the change that people don't even realize, because so much of it was him propelling others forward and encouraging others, being a visionary for others, is something that it's not hyperbole to say that it will reverberate through Klal Yisrael. It will be felt in such a profound way. Klal Yisrael didn't just lose a great man and didn't just lose a great Rav, but lost a manhig. And the other thing that I will say that is just very striking is that Rabbi Howard's yard site is Shmini Atzeres. For those of you who know Rabbi Howard, know also that the events of October 7th profoundly wounded him. He felt the pain of Klal Yisrael in an incredibly acute way. And he carried the pain of Klal Yisrael in such an acute way. Rabbi Howard was just here in our shul for Gabi's grandson's bris on Hoshana Rabbah. He was here in our shul, and I remember that, we exchanged a Shalom Aleichem and a few short words. And it's always interesting because, on Hoshana Rabbah, the hostages were released, and there is such, I think for many, a sense of euphoria. But I saw Rabbi Howard almost like a certain, not reservedkeit, but a feeling of this is a tremendous simcha, but there's still a lot more. There's still a lot more that has to happen. And he was a man, he was a leader who walked with that responsibility on his shoulders, who carried it. He carried the klal. That's what he did. He carried the klal. And when Klal Yisrael loses someone who carries them, it's like a child, right? A child needs someone. Every child needs someone to pick them up. So what does a child do, Rahman al-Islam, when a child doesn't have a parent to pick them up? The child figures it out. Child always figures it out. but it's so much harder. And when Klal Yisrael loses a leader who helped them, who picked them up, the Klal feels it. He carried the Klal. He carried the Klal. And it is a tremendous, overwhelming loss of Klal Yisrael. I can't imagine just the overwhelming nature of the loss for his mishpacha. And we should just hope that Eretz Hashem, he should be a model, a role model for all of us about what Mesiras Nefesh for the Klal means, about the need to worry a little less about ourselves and a little bit more for the other, a little bit more for community, a little bit more for Am Yisrael, for Eretz Yisrael, not just for people in your own circle, but for just the Klal, to be a Klal Jew. That's what Rabbi Hauer, Sechet Tzadik V'Kadosh Levracha, was, a Klal Jew. We should be Zevachim Eretz Hashem to try in some small way to emulate his example, and in doing so provide his precious neshama with an aliyah. May he find menucha tachas kanfei hashchina, and may HaKadosh Baruch Hu give his family and his extended family of Klal Yisrael the strength to be able to move forward in these difficult times. Tenishmasa tzrura b'tzar hachayim. We'll say, let's Eretz Hashem, Lulei Soras Chashashuai, as Avadati Ba'ani. David HaMelech tells us, were it not for the anchor of Torah, were it not for the emotional story, we would be lost, and our suffering would be lost in our sadness. So we take our broken heart, and we come back to Maseches. We come back to Maseches Zevachim, Eretz Hashem, and let's begin the new parak in Eretz Hashem, Kol Hapsulin. So today's daf is Lamed Beis, Leiv, and the HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us chizik all the time. And he tells us, I know your heart is broken in a million different pieces, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, just stick with me. I've guided you through tekufas of broken hearts before, and I will guide you through tekufas of broken hearts again. So an interesting halacha here. So we're beginning at the Mishnah on the bottom of Lamed Aleph Lamed Beis, 31b. So the Mishnah says as follows, all the psulim, so remember again, these are all the individuals who are normally unfit for sacrificial service, who went ahead and did shchita. Ultimately, again, their shchita is kosher. Shchita kshera bizarim. Ultimately, again, because shchita is kosher with non-kohanim, ubenashim, ube'avadim, ubetmeim, va'afilu b'kadshei kadashim. So we'll say, so again, so halacha l'maisa, this already is not very new to us, but this is the concept that ultimately, again, shchita is not an avoda. Because shchita is not an avoda, therefore, it is kosher even with a pasul. Kosher even with a pasul. So the Gemara, so therefore the Mishnah says, therefore any of these individuals, non-kohanim, now again I will say, the Tamei piece we'll talk about, non-kohanim, women, avodim, tmeim, are mutter for shchita, even by kachei kadashim, right? Even by the highest levels of karbanos. Ubilvad, shelo yu tmeim nogim b'basar. Now, of course, obviously, if someone is tamei, so they can't go ahead and touch the sacrificial meat. Now, understand, obviously, tumah is only communicated to slaughtered meat. Tumah will not be communicated ultimately again to a live animal. You can't communicate tumah. So again, we'll discuss exactly how this is done, how someone who is tamei could shecht, we'll talk about. But lamaisa, the point over to remember is that technically it's mutter. Therefore, hein postin b'machshava. Now, this is very interesting. This goes back to last parak. Remember, you could only invalidate a karban with an erroneous mindset if what? If you are fit for the avoda. If you're not fit for the avoda, essentially you can't make it pigel. You can't make it chutz limkomo or chutz lizmano. So therefore, the Mishnah says is as follows. Interestingly enough, because all of these individuals are kosher, ultimately again are kosher for shchita, therefore if they have an invalidating thought, they could invalidate the shchita. Top of Lamed Beis, v'kulan shekiblu es adam chutz lizmano v'chutz limkomo, and ultimately again all of them who have received the blood outside of, now again this is with a machshava, right? If one of these people did Kabbalah, and I will say, now none of these people are allowed to do Kabbalah, right? They could all do shchita, but Kabbalah is an avoda. So because Kabbalah is an avoda, it requires a kosher kohen. Therefore, if any of these individuals did Kabbalah, and they had during Kabbalah a machshava, right, an erroneous mindset for chutz lizmano or chutz limkomo, im yesh dam hanefesh, right, yachzir hakasher v'yikabel. So both say this is very interesting. This is quite fascinating. So now imagine. So now, first part of the Mishnah is everyone is fit to do shchita. Because everyone is fit to do shchita, therefore halacha l'maisa, even if one of these people has an erroneous mindset, chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo, they can invalidate the carbon. That's part one. Part two, these individuals are not fit to do Kabbalah. Therefore, if one of them did Kabbalah, and during Kabbalah had an erroneous mindset, chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo. So this is very interesting. The Mishnah, you know what you should do? If there's still lifeblood spurting out of the animal, do another Kabbalah. Fascinating. So you get another Kohen out there, do another Kabbalah, and take that blood. Similarly, let's say again, interestingly enough, a regular Kohen did Kabbalah, and then that Kohen gave it to someone who's pasul. Now, remember we had this case. This came up because when we were talking about halacha, what happens with halacha if you don't move your feet and you just move your hand? We had this whole discussion. So let's say Kohen, regular Kohen, did Kabbalah, and then he handed it over to Eved. So the halacha is no problem. Just Kohen, take it back, and we're good to go. Kibel b'yamino v'nasam b'smolo. Similarly, again, if the Kohen did Kabbalah in his right hand, and then he moved the kli over to his left hand, which he can't do. He's supposed to do everything with the right hand. Ultimately, yachzir liyamino. Halacha l'maisa, give it back to the right hand. Give it back to the right hand. Kibel b'kli kodesh. V'nasan likli chol. If halacha l'maisa again, Kiba b'kli kodesh, b'nasan l'kli chol. Sorry, just giving me up. If a person goes ahead and receives, the Kohen goes ahead and receives the blood in a kli kodesh is a kli sharis. Then he transfers the contents ultimately again to a mundane utensil. Yachzir likli kodesh. He can return the contents back to a regular kli sharis. So we'll say this is actually very interesting because in all of these cases, what the Mishnah is saying is that halacha l'maisa, even if you did something wrong, you could rectify this scenario. You could rectify it back. You could go ahead and fix it. Which I will say is I just want to point out, such a profound Gemara to begin. Like, the beautiful part in Yiddishkeit is there's multiple New Years. So for us, like we've been celebrating new starts multiple times right in the last couple of weeks. But how beautiful is it that, what's the theme of the Mishnah? What's the theme of the Mishnah? If you make a mistake, you can fix it. If you make a mistake, you can fix it. Okay, so you put it in the wrong kli, you could go ahead and return it back into a kli sharis, and you're good to go. Nishbach min kli ala ritzbah. If let's say again, it's another interesting case. You received the blood in a kli sharis, and then the blood spilled on the ground, the asfo, and you collect it back up, kosher. Now again, we'll say, if you remember again, this is in contradistinction to the other case where the blood initially falls on the ground, right? If the blood falls on the ground initially before ever going into a kli sharis, it's pasul. But if it goes into a kli sharis first and then falls into the ground, ultimately you could collect it back up. But Shabbos says another profound Musar Haskell, which is what? If you embed yourself in a framework of kedusha, it is much easier to get back up after you fall, right? So if you start off in the kli sharis, you have kedusha. If you fall on the ground, we could pick you back up. You could get collected back up. If you go right from the animal onto the ground, you're pasul. There's nothing to support you. But if you bolster yourself with good ruchnius, ultimately again, you could pick yourself back up in the aftermath of difficulty. The Gemara goes weiter. Nasan es hanitnin lemata lemalon. Did I skip? Sorry. Nasna gabi akevesh. Shalo kineged hayisod. Let's say he put the blood. We actually just saw this on Chalamayid. If you put the blood on the ramp, not opposite the base. So we're going to get this, which is why I sent out my Beis HaMikdash pictures last night. So we're going to talk about this again. If you applied the blood on the ramp, normally blood was not applied on the ramp. Blood was applied on the side of the mizbeach, or the corners of the mizbeach, which we'll discuss. And you didn't do it opposite the base. Remember, the base, the mizbeach itself had a little bit of like a base, a trim on the bottom. And again, blood was placed in that, towards that area. So let's say, in other words, idea is it was wrong, erroneous placement. You placed it on the ramp, not by the base. Or nasanes hanitana lamata lamala, des hanitana lamala lamata. So, or you went ahead and remember, we'll talk about this. We'll say there was a chuta sikra. There was like a red line that went across the mizbeach, and some blood was applied above the line, some blood was applied below the line. Let's say you made a mistake and you put, above line blood below the line, or below the line blood above the line, or bifnim bachutz, sanitanim bifnim bachutz, sanitanim bachutz bifnim, or Allah Lamaisa, again, certain blood that was supposed to be sprinkled inside the mikdash, you did it outside, or vice versa. What's the halacha? Im yesh dam hanefesh yachzir hakasher v'yikabel. Ultimately, again, if the Gemara says, if there's still, interestingly enough, in all of these cases, if there's still lifeblood coming out of the animal, so the Gemara just says, Kohen, go back and re-receive the blood. Re-receive the blood, so you could rectify this entire situation. Okay, incredible. Now the Gemara launches into a very interesting discussion here. Shachto the evet in lechatchila lo. So the Mishnah says, if you look at the lashon of the Mishnahs, kala psulin sheshachto. All of these psulin, right? All these individuals who are apostle, if they shechted. Now the lashon of sheshachto, if they shechted, that's a lashon of b'diavad, ex post facto. So in other words, what the Mishnah seems to be telling me is, we don't want these people to shecht, but if these people did shecht, ultimately, again, their shchita is kosher. So shachto, the evet in lechatchila lo. Okay, so Gemara says, all of these people, you're right, if they did shecht, their shchita is kosher, but ideally, we'd like them not to do it. So Gemara says, really, is that true? Or minhum is the kasha, v'shachat, the pasuk says v'shachat. V'shachat is ben abakar, v'ben abakar lefnei Hashem, v'kriva b'nei Aaron HaKohanim. So v'shachat, what does that teach me? Shchita kshera b'zar. Ultimately, again, teaches me that shchita b'zar kshera. So ultimately, it teaches me that shchita is kosher even with a non-Kohen. Shchita kshera b'zarim, u'b'nashim, u'ba'avadim, u'b'tmeim. Ultimately, again, because shchita is kosher by non-Kohanim, by women, by avodim, by tmeim, va'afilu b'kadshe kadoshim. And even again with highest sanctity karbanos. Oh, eino ela b'kohanim. Or you might have thought that halacha l'maisa, it's only kosher by kohanim. So we'll say, hear what's happening over here? A very interesting drasha, just really based on the word v'shachat. V'shachat. So the Gemara says, oh, eino ela b'kohanim, or maybe you'll say shchita is only kosher by kohanim. V'chi me'ayin basa. So the Gemara says, well, let's go back. Where did all of this start? Michlal shene'emar ata uvanecha itcha. I'm sorry, ata uvanecha itcha tishmoras kunaschem l'chol dvar mizbeach. So we'll say, there's another pasuk. The pasuk says, literally again, talking to Aaron, you and your sons will safeguard the kahuna for all matters of the altar. Yachol af b'shchita. I might have thought that means that even Kohanim have to do shchita. Talmud lomar v'shachat es ben habakar lifnei Hashem v'hikrivo. Therefore, the pasuk says, ultimately he will shecht the cow, the ben habakar, the calf, before Hashem v'hikrivo, and he will offer it. In other words, it was like just the pasuk the way I was reading it is v'shachat es ben habakar lifnei Hashem v'hikrivo b'nei Aaron HaKohanim. So it's an interesting dichotomy or an interesting split. So there's v'shachat es ben habakar lefnei Hashem, kama v'hikrivo b'nei Aaron HaKohanim. What does that teach you? That teaches me ultimately again mikabala ve'ilich mitzvahs kahuna. Ultimately again from Kabbalah and on, that's where there is a mitzvah of kahuna. Limeid ala shchita sheksher ba'achol adam. Ultimately, again, this teaches me ultimately again that shchita is kosher by all pieces, by all people, right? All people are fit ultimately again to do shchita. To which the Gemara says, "Who adin?" So the idea over here is, what do you see from here? We have a little bit of a contradiction because from our Mishnah, again, everyone's agreeing on the fact. What's the fact? Shchita kshera bizar. A non-Kohen could go ahead and do shchita. The difference is from our Mishnah, it sounds like this is a din b'diavad, right? Meaning that ideally get a Kohen to do the shchita. If there's no Kohen to do the shchita is kshera bizar. Fine. But halacha l'maisa, again, when you look at just the brayso the Gemara just quoted, it sounds like l'chatchila, ultimately again it's permitted. To which the Gemara says, Hu adin dafi lechatchila nami. You're right. Really, the halacha is Rabbosai that lechatchila shchitas kshera bizar, which Rabbosai is such a fascinating idea, right? Which again, it all makes a lot of sense if we go at the idea that shchita is not an avoda. Because it's not an avoda, Stephen lechatchila ultimately again is kshera bizar. So why does our Mishnah frame it as a b'diavad? It's very simple. Because remember, there's a lot of people grouped in that category. One of the members of that category are tmeim. The Rabbi says, technically speaking, someone who is tamei could do shchita, sacrificial shchita. Now, how they could do that, we'll discuss, right? Because if you're tamei, you can't come into the confines of the Beis Hamikdash. So we'll discuss how it can get done, but it can get done. But everyone would agree that clearly that is not lechatchila. That's a b'diavad. So once one of the members of the group is a b'diavad, the Mishnah framed the whole discussion as a b'diavad. But in reality, a zar can shech lechatchila. Because again, by a tamei, why don't we want a tamei to shecht? Because we're afraid, ultimately, again, that halacha l'maisa, they may come to inadvertently touch the slaughtered meat, which could then transfer tumah. So because we don't want a tamei lechatchila shechting, so therefore, ultimately, we phrase it as a b'diavad. But in reality, it's only the tamei who can do a b'diavad, but the zar can do it even lechatchila. So therefore, again, tana shachtu. So therefore, so I just want to point out what just happened over here. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, and this is a very important piece to understand, that halacha l'maisa, the Gemara is not telling us that a zar is permitted lechatchila to shecht a carbon. So why does the Mishnah frame it as a b'diavad? What's the answer to that? Because since the Mishnah is not just talking about zar, it's talking about other people, and these other people, specifically tamei, should not shecht lechatchila. Why? Lest he come to touch the slaughtered meat and make it tamei. So therefore, he's a b'diavad. Once he's a b'diavad, ultimately, again, then the rest of the group becomes a b'diavad as well, which Rabbi says is another tremendous Musar Haskell as well, which shows you that halacha l'maisa, be very careful of the company that you keep. Because if you're part of a b'diavad chevra, then ultimately, again, that makes you b'diavad over time as well. So you see this, right, the zar himself is lechatchila, but because he is grouped together with the tamei, therefore, by definition, again, it's almost like, not I want to say oil rasha, oil shcheno, but sometimes, again, ultimately, again, that the company that you keep has an impact. Ultimately, again, who you're say it's incredible. By the way, how many profound lessons already that we've learned today. Right, number one, if you make a mistake, right, you could always fix your mistake. Number two, if you embed yourself in an atmosphere of kedusha, the blood goes into the klishares, and then it falls on the floor. You can always pick it back up. Right, bolster yourself with kedusha. That way, when you fall, which you will, you could always redeem yourself. As opposed to if you're never in the klisharis and you fall on the floor, very difficult to pick yourself back up. Ultimately, be careful of the company that you keep, because if you find yourself in the wrong chevra in the Mishnah, you're b'diavad. But if you surround yourself with lechatchila people, that'll make you lechatchila as well. Lastly, I'll just add in, it's interesting to note that shchita's kshera bizar. Anyone could do shchita, but Kabbalah is only Kohanim. And we'll say, what does this mean? Anyone could destroy. Anyone could do shchita. Anyone, you don't need special qualifications to deconstruct. Anyone could destruct, anyone could destroy, anyone could do anything. Kabbalah, like to be a makabel, to be a person who's able to receive, whether it's receiving critique, whether it's receiving criticism, whether it's receiving suffering, difficulty, that you need to be holding, that you need to be a Kohen, I have to work on myself to be a makabel. Anyone could do shchita, anyone could destroy and deconstruct, but mikabala ve'elech, to be a makabel Jew for everything that comes your way in life, that needs a Kohen, that needs a person of a specific type of spiritual persona, spiritual metal. Incredible. V'tami di eved shapir, Dami will say first wide line. Now, is it true? Is it true that a tamei, ultimately, again, I will say, now this is interesting, because now what the Mishnah is saying is, and this is really a little bit mind-blowing, really, a tamei could shecht a carbon b'diavad? That's permitted? I will say, once again, we seem to have a very simple logistical obstacle to that reality, which is, a tamei is not permitted to come into the Beis HaMikdash. So if you can't come into the Beis HaMikdash, how exactly are you offering a karban? So the Gemara says, Raminu, both say first wide line, v'samach v'shachat. Pasuk says, Pasuk has v'samach, smicha, which represents leaning on the animal. Again, we'll talk about that more. V'shachat, and you will shecht. So the Gemara says, mas smicha b'tahorim. Just like smicha ultimately again is by a tahar, af shrita b'tahorim. So too shrita is by tahorim as well. Right? Just like smicha requires a tar, so too shrita requires a tar. To which the Shavuot says, so again, does indicate that you can't do shrita if you're a tamei. To which the Gemara says, midrabanan. You're right, really midrabanan, or midaraisa. Midaraisa, ultimately, again, it is mutter. Midrabanan, we don't want a tamei doing shchita. Why? Rashi says, Shema yiga babasar. We're afraid that ultimately, again, he's going to touch the sacrificial meat. Maishna smicha. Why is smicha different? Because the pasuk says, you do smicha, where lifnei Hashem? Shchita nami haksil lifnei Hashem. But shchita also says, lifnei Hashem, to which the Gemara says, Efshar da'avid sakin aruka. V'shachit. Oh, so here it is. Right? So how does a tamei do shchita? And what's the answer? Very carefully. Right? In other words, I will say you take a very long knife, and essentially he stands outside. Now, where outside we're going to discuss. That's why the truth is, you didn't really need the Beis HaMikdash pictures for today. But I love Beis HaMikdash pictures. So I'm not going to lie, I jumped the gun a little bit on it. You don't really need it because we're only going to make a very short reference to it today. But how can you do it? Sakin aruka. So again, we'll have to see exactly where the tamei is standing. But essentially, if the tamei is standing in a permitted area, has a very long knife, the knife itself reaches into the Beis HaMikdash and he slaughters the animal inside of the Beis HaMikdash. That could work. To which the Gemara says, smicha nami, but 1 second. I can say something with smicha. After the ma'ayil yadei v'samich. So we'll say ultimately again. So again, why can't you do the same thing with smicha? Let the tamei stand outside of the precincts of the Beis HaMikdash and what? Extend his hands in. To which the Gemara says, kasavar bias mikzas shma bia. So this is very interesting because essentially he holds what we'll call partial entry represents complete entry. In other words, the havamina is that if a tamei person just sticks his hands inside of the airsphere, inside the Beis HaMikdash, that's not called entry into the Beis HaMikdash. Which I will say, by the way, I just want to point out how beautiful this is. This is another kiss from HaKadosh Baruch Hu because this is a big sukkah sugya. I will say, remember again, how big does your sukkah? What is the minimum shear of a sukkah? Minimum shear of a sukkah? Rosho verubo. As long as your head and the majority of your body could fit in your sukkah, that's a kosher sukkah. So what do you see from that? What you see is that generally, halachically, where are you situated? You're situated wherever the majority of your body is situated. So therefore, again, I would have thought that therefore just extending, if I'm tamei, extending my hands into the Beis HaMikdash does not do anything. That's not called entry. Kamash malan, the Gemara says it is. Bia b'miktzas shma bia. Partial entry is ultimately, again, still called entry. So therefore, again, that's not going to work. It's not going to work. So I just point out, again, another beautiful Musa Haskell in this. Bia b'miktzas shma bia. What's the Musa Haskell? Such a beautiful idea. I will say that sometimes in life, I can't get my whole self where I need to get to. It's hard. I know where I want to be. I know where I need to be, and I can't get there. So we think that sometimes, if I dip my pinky toe, into Kedusha, I extend my hands into Kedusha, my body's not there, right? The majority of me, which of us, we all have things like this. Like, it could very well be that the majority of my life or a good part of my life is not where I want it to be. But there are things that are working well and things that I am doing that are meaningful. And all too often we think to ourselves like, well, those things that are working well are clearly eclipsed by the things that are not. It's not true. It's not true. I might have a lot of things that are really misfiring and not going well, but bia b'miktzas, shma bia, even partial entry into the Beis HaMikdash, even partial kedusha, even some things that are working well and going well, even if there's a lot of stuff that's not, the things that are going well are still meaningful in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and should be meaningful in your eyes as well. Incredible. Rav Chisda Masnei Ibcha, Rav Chisda ultimately had an opposite idea. V'samach, and he said, V'samach v'shachat, says ultimately again, V'samach v'shachat, he'll do smicha and he'll do shchita. Ma shchita b'tahorin. So just like shchita ultimately again is, just like shchita ultimately is b'tahorin. In other words, shchita has to be done with someone who is tahar. Af smicha b'tahorin. So to smicha should only be done with someone who is tahar, by someone who is tahar. So the Gemara says, Maishna shchita. And I will say, remember, this is an alternate version of the previous discussion. Maishna shchita. Why does shchita have to be done with someone who is tahar? Obviously, this contradicts the Mishnah, right? Maishna shchita, dichsiv lifnei Hashem, because it says shchita is done before God. So before God obviously has a connotation, ultimately again of tara, of purity. Smicha nami ksiv lifnei Hashem. I by smicha it also says lifnei Hashem. No, smicha is different. Why? After the ma'al yodei v'samech, you could always extend your hands. Again, just alternate version. You could always extend your hands. In other words, the tummy person could stand outside, or the person could stand outside and just extend his hands into the Beis Hamikdash. And there says to do smicha, to which the Gemara says, shchita nami afsha da'avid sakin aruka v'shachit. Well, shchita, you could also do that, right? Shchita, you could also stand outside and extend a long knife. To which the Gemara says, Hamani Shimon HaTeimani. Who is this? This is Shimon HaTeimani. What does Shimon HaTeimani say? Tisanya. Shabbos say, remembering a very interesting idea over here. So what does he say? Tisanya, V'shachat es ben habakar lifnei Hashem. This is very interesting. So Pasuk says, V'shachat es ben habakar lifnei Hashem. You shall offer up, you shall slaughter the ben habakar lifnei Hashem. V'lo hashochet lifnei Hashem. Right? So what does this mean? So ultimately again, and not the shochet lifnei Hashem. What does that mean? Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. It's the third line down from the top of Rashi. The shochet lifnei Hashem. Shemratza omet chutz la'azara v'shochet b'sakin aruka. Ultimately again, what does this mean? So we'll say, this is very interesting. Shimon HaTeimani makes the following drasha. A carbon has to be offered up lifnei Hashem. Now what does lifnei Hashem mean on a most basic level? Inside of the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash, which tells me what has to be lifnei Hashem. Ultimately, again, the carbon. What doesn't have to be, or who doesn't have to be lifnei Hashem? The shochet. Now we'll say, now how could the shochet not be lifnei Hashem? Very simple. He's outside with a long knife. With a long knife. Fascinating. Now we'll say that's the Tanakama. Shimon HaTeimani says no. Minayin shu yadav shel shochet lifnim min hanishchat. So Shimon HaTeimani says just the opposite. He says, literally translated, how do I know that the hands of the slaughterer have to be even further in than the item being slaughtered? Which is not a literal statement, but rather what it means is, Shimon HaTeimani says, how do I know that the shochet must be like the animal inside of the actual precincts of the Beis Hamikdash? Talmud Lomar, v'shachat es ben habakar lifnei Hashem. Watch how he darshans it. Shochet es ben habakar, the one who slaughters the animal, yehei lifnei Hashem. See, he understands that lifnei Hashem is a modifier for both what? Shochet and ben habakar. Ben habakar, I have to say, this is actually quite a fascinating and riveting machlokes, which you would have to imagine must have come up in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, and Halav will encounter again soon. So Tanakama says the din of lifnei Hashem is only on the carbon. The carbon's got to be inside of the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash, but ultimately, again, the shochet doesn't have to be. He could stand outside, long knife, and shech like that. Shimon HaTeimani says, absolutely not. Lifnei Hashem goes both. It's a modifier both on Ben Bakar and the shochet. Both have to be Lifnei Hashem. Incredible. So that's our machlokes. Amar Ula. So we'll say. So by the way, I just want to point out. The halacha is we clearly the Mishnah is saying that a tamei can shecht. Now, the only way a tamei, although again we'll discuss more cases, but for now it sounds like the only way a tamei is shechting is with a sakin aruka, with a long knife. That's what it sounds like is happening over here. Again, I will say a lot of this discussion is also going to hinge on what, whenever it comes to tumah, you always have to ask, what's the follow-up question? Exactly. What type? Right. Good. Shkach, everyone. Right. Boker tov. Right. Correct. What type of tumah? Because obviously the type of tumah will determine where you can come to, which parts of the Beis Hamikdash precincts you're allowed to be in. So that's going to be the follow-up. But for now, we have this fundamental machlokes. Amar Ula. Ula says as follows. Amar Reish Lakish, Tamei, shehichnis yado lifnim. So Ula says like this. A Tamei, ultimately, again, who extends his hand inside of the Beis Hamikdash. This is a very interesting case, right? Not shchita right now. Not shchita. Reuven is Tamei. And what does Reuven do? He extends his hands inside the interior of the Beis Hamikdash. He's not touching anything. It's just in the airspace of the Beis Hamikdash, loka. He gets malchus. For what? Shneimar b'chal kodesh lo siga. Fascinating. Because the pasuk says you can't touch any kodesh. So the act of inserting your hand into the airspace of the Beis Hamikdash, ultimately again, is punishable by malchus. So the Gemara says, makish bia l'negia. So the Torah ultimately equates entry with touching. Ma negia b'miktzas shma negia, just like ultimately again, touching. And Rabbi say, if you touch kodesh, does it matter how much you touch? No, you touch with your pinky, you touch with your hand, you touch with two hands, makes no difference. Any amount of contact ultimately again is significant. Af bia b'miktzas shma bia. So to ultimately entry in any way is also called entry. So therefore, even halacha l'maisa, even what does that mean? Even inserting your hand into the Beis Hamikdash, even though your body is outside, is still going to be considered problematic. Says Rabbi Shmuel Ula. So Rabbi Shmuel brought up to Ula. Rabbi say this is where I guess I jumped in a little bit on the Beis Hamikdash, but it's quite interesting. Ultimately, again, so the Gemara says as follows. So Metzora, whose 8th day fell out on Erev Pesach. Now, what does this mean? So remember, Metzora, individual who has contracted saras, he has a purification process. His purification process is, right, there's a number of things that are there. Remember, there's the passage of time, there is karbanos, and then ultimately, again, there's sprinkling of blood. Now, interestingly enough, what we're going to see is the Metzora is this fascinating anomaly. How is he a halachic anomaly? Because where does the blood application take place? It's got to take place inside of the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash. The issue is that he is Tamei. So we're going to see by the way, where he comes to is a gate that is called Shar Nikanor. Can I borrow your sheet just for a second? So again, like I said, this is totally gratuitous. We don't need it, but I want to show it to you anyway. This is Shar Nikanor right over here. This is Shar Nikanor, right? So this is what's called the Ezras Nashim. Again, we're going to get into all of this. This is called the Chatzar over here. This area over there was a staircase. This is Shar Nikanor, this gate. It is this gate that the Metzora would come up to. Kohen would come out on the other side of this gate. And again, we're going to see a whole discussion about the width of the gate. What's the status of the width? Is the width Kodesh? Is it Chol? So this is where the Metzora would be able to enter into this part, what we call again the Ezras Nashim. Come up to the stairs, come right up to this gate over here, and this is where the blood application would be. Thank you. So the Gemara says, again, like I said, we're going to get into all of this. So the Gemara says as follows. So this is an interesting case. So let's say you have Metzora, and his 8th day fell out on Erev Pesach. Okay? So now watch this. V'ra'a keri bo bayo. Bless you. All right. He's having one of those days, right? One of those, you're Metzora, then you become Balkari. So what happens? So we'll say, so now we have an issue. The issue is it's his 8th day, which is his purification day. The problem is now he's a Balkari, right? He's a Balkari. Now the problem is, and now again it's not finished, V'tavo, he went to the mikvah. What does that make him? A Tvul Yom. See, he's an 8th day Metzora who is also a Tvul Yom. What's the problem? An 8th day Metzora could enter into the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash. A Tvul Yom cannot enter into the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash. It's Erev Pesach, which means he needs to do a Karban Pesach. So what do I do with all of this? Amru Chacham Nechum said, Afa pi shein Tvul Yom acher nichnas, ze nichnas. Even though normally a Tvul Yom can't enter into the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash, this guy is allowed to. Why? Mutav yavo aseh sheyesh bo kares v'yitcha aseh she'ein bo kares. So Rabbi says it's fascinating because let the aseh that has kares. What's the aseh that has kares? That's Karban Pesach. right? Because if you don't do Karban Pesach, there's a Chi of Kares. So let the Asay that carries with it Kares trump the Asay that doesn't have Kares. What's the Asay that doesn't have Kares? That's the Asay which prevents a Tvul Yom from coming to the Makom Mikdash. We're going to challenge that in just a moment. So Rabbi says, isn't this fascinating? So therefore, Halacha L'maisa, the Gemara says, an 8th day Mitzorah who becomes a Balkari, who went to the mikvah and now is a Tvul Yom, we would say normally, don't come to the Beis HaMikdash, you're a Tvul Yom. But because it's Erev Pesach and there's an Asay to bring Karban Pesach, and if you don't bring Karban Pesach, there's a Chi of Kares, let the Asay that has Kares trump the Asay that doesn't have Kares, and therefore let him come and do the Karban Pesach. Well, do his Tara and then do the Karban Pesach. Rabbi Yochanan says, Devar Torah, Afilu Asay bo. That's not true, by the way. For a Balkari, there's not really even an Asay. There's not an Asay which will prevent him from coming to the basement. The Shneimar, Vayamod Yoshafat Bekal Yehuda, Yerushalayim Beis Hashem B'fnei HaChatzar HaChadasha. So the pasuk says Yoshafat came with the Kal Yehuda in Yerushalayim in front of the Chatzar HaChadasha. Ma Chatzar Chadasha, what's the new Chatzar? Rabbi Yochanan, Shechidshu B'dvarim. Ultimately, they made a Chiddush. What's the Chiddush? The Gemara says, what was the Chiddush? Amru Tvul Yom Al Yikanes L'Machane Leviyah. They made a Chiddush that a Tvul Yom can't come, Machane Leviyah, both for our purposes, means Harabayis. That a Tvul Yom can't come to Harabayis. So Rabbi says, that was the Chiddush. Now, what does that show you? That shows you that it's not even a din. It's not even a Doraisa. There is no Doraisa about Tvul Yom. Apparently, again, Tvul Yom not coming to the Harabayis, apparently, ultimately, again, was just, I don't know which one, we'll call it a takana. I don't know, a takana. And therefore, again, the 8th day Mitzorah, who became a Balkari and a Tvul Yom, of course he should come to the Beis HaMikdash, because again, there's an Asay that has Kares, ultimately, again, versus a takana. So we'll stop over here for today. I'm leaving off a little bit in the middle. This, where we're going to get into now, but says 1 second. We just said before that if a Tameh extends his hands into the airspace of the Beis HaMikdash, so what's the halacha? That's Aser, which tells you Bia b'Mikdash Shma Bia. What's the problem we're going to see? A Metzorah, the way he becomes Tahar is he extends his hands into the area of the Beis HaMikdash. So how does that shin? How does that work? Based on what we learned, that should be unequivocally Aser. Resolution and halacha l'maaseh meretz Hashem tomorrow. Shkach Abosei. Thank you everyone on Zoom. Shkach everyone. Just share besoros tovos.
Telling Mr. Rua off yesterday by a person can be formed the fourth wall of a sukkah if he's sitting there. Is he considered inside the sukkah to eat?